So we're going to sew with the Super 8 pattern, and I'm going to try and explain why I do this the way I do. All of my pieces are stamped and cut. You can see the dashed lines are the sewing lines, and one of the reasons that helps you is this type of pattern has many, I guess, sort of Y seams, but it makes it easier because with them stamped, you know where to start and stop. And the first thing we're going to do is match up. We're going to do a center that has 8 of these diamonds, and I'm going to alternate the color of the diamonds. And so I'm just going to lay the pink on top, and we're going to sew them into pairs. And I'm going to start on the sewing line. I reverse back. I also take my stitch length down a little bit. And again, only sew to the corner of the sewing lines. And so the center star on this has 8 of these points. And so I'm going to sew them first into pairs. So there'll be 4 pairs like this. So once I've got them sewn into pairs, what we're going to do is just sew 2 pairs together, and you're just going to keep adding until all 8 of these pieces are sewn together. And so I'm just going to finger press them open, and you want the seams to the outside of where you're sewing. So I'm going to match up this green to the pink here. Same thing, these seams also to the outside of where you're sewing. And then you can feel it tucked into where those seams are to the outside. That's where you're going to start your point on the sewing line and reverse back at the corners and go to the outside of the sew line and reverse back. And just keep adding until all of those points are sewn together and you've got 8 points. So I'm going to sew that last seam together of those 8 points, making sure all of the seams are pulled to the outside. You don't want to snag any of them. And the reason for this is we iron everything in a circular fashion, and that allows the seams, when you've got that many seams coming together, it allows those seams to spin and go out of the way of that center. There you go. Okay, I went and pressed that, and you can see how these seams are all laying the same direction in a circle, and those points press in a circular fashion. And then you've got a nice little center, and they are pressed good. So the next piece we're going to add is, this is going to be our flower piece here. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew, line up the edges, and these seams are to the outside, and I'm going to line up that edge. You can feel where it hits where you're supposed to stop is where those seams are pulled to the outside edge. So you're not, if you stop on your line like you're supposed to, you're not going to hit that other seam. So these are sort of what I call either inset seams. Some people call them Y seams. But the beauty of this, you sew every seam individually. And so you are never sewing off the edge, and what it allows is all of this gets ironed in a circular fashion, and because you have all of these points coming together, more seams than you would typically have, then this allows those seams to spin. And so my machine doesn't trim my threads, and it's really easy for me to just come back and trim after and line up those edges and keep sewing. And so I'm going to sew, there's 8 of these. So what this is based on an octagon, but it ends up being a square traditional looking block, but all of your pieces are the same size. And so in a sense we're doing the Y seam, but we're doing one half of the Y seam. We're not pivoting, we're not clipping any fabric to try and get those points together. And the nice thing about the stamp method, you don't have to guess where to stop. Where is that 1/4 inch? Have I gone far enough, too far? And so this works out really good. So I've got my threads trimmed, and now I'm going to sew that other seam, the other half of that Y seam. And all you're going to do is, because you haven't caught those seams, you're going to spin those seams, pull those seams to the outside. And I like to start from the inside edge and work to my outside edge. And again, sewing, laying the foot down, sewing a couple stitches, and reverse back at the corner. And at this point, what I do is I typically line up all of my blocks and do things in an assembly line fashion. So like I'll work on my centers first and press, and then work on one edge of this little flower, and then start flipping them and working on the other edge. Now I'm on my last edge. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is on blocks like this where there are a lot of pieces, you want to sew the pieces so you're sewing on the edge of the stamped line toward the outside, and don't be wanting to sew extra because the block will shrink. Then you're trimming blocks and it doesn't match up. And so I found I just sew right to the outside edge of that line. And so we're going to do the diamonds. We're doing the diamonds the same way. We're going to sew down one edge and then come back, flip the blocks out, and sew down the other edge. And on the center, I used 2 different colors because I really liked when they're matching and next to each other. You can't really see that nice star point, so it's fun to do it in 2 different colors. And the other secret to this method is when you are stamping, make sure you cut the pieces out accurately, because if you've cut and left one at an 1/8 inch, and let's say the one it's matching up to is an 1/8 inch, before long you've got pieces that aren't matching because they weren't really cut to the same size. So now, once I've got one side of that diamond in there, I'm going to come back and flip those seams to the outside and pull the edges together so those points will line up. So again, you're just flipping the seams to the outside, which is possible to do because you haven't caught any of those seams. You're going to pull all the seams to the outside and match up those edges and sew, start down, reverse back, sew to the edge of the sew line, and then keep repeating yourself as you go around, flipping those edges around, seams to the outside, away from where you're sewing, lining up those edges, And you can see that those edges line up really nicely. And do it until all 8 points have the second seam sewn. And line up those edges. So because you reverse back, let's say you catch a seam. So right here I've caught maybe 1 stitch too much. So it doesn't want to flip exactly like I want. I just trim one of those stitches, line up those edges, pull those seams to the outside, and you're ready to go. And that's what's nice with reversing back. You've tacked that really well. Okay, I've got the last point sewn there, and we're going to add our next pieces. So the corner of the block has 3 squares, so 1, 2, and then another colored one that connects the 2 white ones that I'm doing. And then you'll have 2 triangles, then the 3 squares. So how I do mine is I go around the outside adding the pieces that are next. Again, pull those seams to the outside. I'm sewing into this seam, so these are pulled away. I'm lining up these 2 edges. So I've got my 2 squares. And then I'm going to do 2 triangles. So this triangle is going to go in like this. So I'm just going to flip this over like this and line up those points there. And those seams are to the outside, and you can feel that's right where that point's going to end, is where those seams are to the outside. And again, sewing just right at that edge, not cheating it to the inside. If you cheat a little to the outside. And you can feel you're lining up your edge. On this edge there's not a point, but if you were to sew off, it's where those 2 edges come together, and you can feel where that's nesting in there, so you know you've got your edge matched up good. And then now 2 squares. So I go around in a circle, 2 squares, 2 triangles, and I like this area to be my white, so that it gives contrast to the flower that you're actually sewing. So we're going to sew in the corners. Same thing, you're just lining up the edges, and only sew from the outside of the sewing line to where those seams are folded back. And then once you get the one seam done, then just flip it, line up those edges, pull all the seams to the outside. And I found I get better seams if I sew from in on the first seam and then from the inside to the outside on the second seam.